And eventually, it turned out that all 18 runners reduced their energy uptake when running in the prototype shoe. And on average, over all the 3 different velocities, that was by 4%.
That Triathlon Show 179. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Dr. Wouter Hoogkamer. Wouter is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Colorado Boulder, and he has been the lead researcher on the independent peer-reviewed studies that established the benefits of Nike's famous new shoe, the Vaporfly 4% shoes, so called because they can improve running economy by 4%. And we will discuss the Nike Vaporfly shoes and running economy and what that actually means for improvements in speed and how that translation works. And also more generally, properties that make shoes more or less economical and more related to these topics. But first, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. And just to remind you of how important it is to individualize your electrolyte intake, some people can lose just 200 milligrams of sodium per liter of sweat, whereas some people can lose over 2,000 milligrams of sodium per liter of sweat. And then when you multiply that by people having different sweat rates, so somebody may sweat twice as much as another, and actually in actual fact we can see up to 5 or 6-fold variances in the individual sweat rates themselves. This means that you have to be deliberate with your electrolyte intake, especially when you're racing longer races and racing in hot environments. And so go to precisionhydration.com, take their free online sweat test, and that will give you an individualized hydration strategy and tell you more about what kind of electrolyte intake you should be looking for in your next race. You can use the promo code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps, to get your first box of electrolyte product for free. And big thanks to Roka. Roka makes swimwear, triathlon apparel, and eyewear, and are trusted by some of the best triathletes in the world, including people like Javier Gomez, Mario Mola, Jesse Thomas, Flora Duffy, Lucy Charles, Katie Zafiris, and Ashley Gentle, to name just a few. But that's the who's who of triathlon today almost. So go and check them out on roka.com. Check out all their product lines. I really love their wetsuits, tri-suits, goggles, and eyewear. So all of them are worth a look if you're looking to buy something new in any of those categories. You can get 20% off your entire order with the promo code TTS, all caps, and again, the URL is roka.com. So without any further ado, let's get into the interview with Dr. Wouter Hoogkamer. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, Wouter.
Hi, nice to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. Why don't you start with just telling us a little bit more about yourself and the work that you do and the research that you're doing?
Yes, so my name is Wouter Hoogkamer. I'm originally from the Netherlands, and I'm currently working at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And I've studied mainly neuromechanics, biomechanics, energetics of how people walk and run. And then most recently in Colorado, focused on the biomechanics and energetics of running. We actually also have been doing a little bit of cycling research, but most prominent is the running research. Been a runner myself. Started out on the track, ran the 400 meters in 48 seconds, and then over the time slowly progressed into being a marathoner with the current 2:32:50 best.
Wow, that's fast. What's your favorite marathon that you run?
I ran that last winter or last fall at CIM, which is in Sacramento, and I really enjoyed that course. It's pretty long, straight stretches, and slightly downhill, sea level. So yeah, I really enjoyed that race.
Okay, cool. Let's start by talking a little bit about the research that you've been doing on the running side of things and footwear in particular. That was the how I first found you and your research through
Yeah.
the footwear research that you've been doing. So, what is it specifically that you've been investigating there?
So we have been studying biomechanics of and energetics of running in various aspects before, but more recently we started to focus more on the role of footwear. And basically, before I joined this lab here, we already sort of got back from the rebound of the barefoot running, where we knew that it's not necessarily always better to wear the lightest shoe out there. The shoe is just not some useless piece of mass on your feet. It's actually has a function, and the cushioning function of shoes has been shown to be beneficial. It saves you energy, and so along those lines, we then started to look further into things. We did first a study where we looked into how footwear mass not only costs you more energy but also slows you down. So we did some runners that came in and did time trials on the indoor track, and then I think most known is the study we did on at that time the Nike prototype shoe, which eventually then turned into the Nike Vaporfly 4% shoe.
And just curious, did you have you run in the Nike Vaporfly since doing that research?
Yes,
And what are
yes,
your thoughts as a runner?
yeah. So yeah, unfortunately, when we first got the first prototypes, they were like size 10 and on the short side, and I'm a 10 and a half. So I could just jam my foot into them and sort of try to run around, but not comfortable enough to actually be in the study or wear them during a longer race. But then, like obviously, when we the study was finished and then the result was published and then the eventual shoe came available, I was just logging into to the website every time they released a new batch, and eventually I got myself a pair. And yeah, I've been happily wearing them for some half and full marathon races, and yeah, I enjoy them.
So let's talk then about the results. I think that that reaction of of getting onto the site and trying to buy the shoes whenever a batch was available
Yeah,
tells us something already. But
yeah,
what did you find when you investigated them and compared them to the other shoes that you had
yeah.
in the study?
So I was really excited for us to be in the lab at that time because I mean I've been following shoe research for a while, and there had been small improvements in running economy. So early on, when the first Nike Air shoes were released, they were a little better than the EVA shoes, and then some people already in the early 2000s put a carbon fiber plate in shoes, and we saw a 1% improvement in running economy. And then there's obviously the Adidas Boost foam when that was introduced and first studied. That was also shown to have a 1% benefit. So and then Nike said we got this new prototype shoe and it might be better than what we have been running on so far. So I was thinking like, all right, that's going to be another 1% maybe, right? Because we have been making shoes for such a long time, so we're just making steady progress. But then when we started testing the shoe, we first had to find sort of the Cinderellas of Boulder. We wanted to test the shoe as fast as we could and make sure that the runners were still at a steady state, not fatiguing over time. So we set out to find 18 runners that were able to run a sub 31 minute 10K. And that was alone already really hard. But then in addition, they also all had to wear this size 10 shoe. But I guess being in Boulder definitely was the key to that, and we managed to find those 18 runners. And then when we eventually just had them run different velocities, basically slightly faster than a 7 minute mile, a 6 minute mile, and then a 5:20 mile. And then in each of those velocities, we compared the new prototype shoe versus the Adidas Adjust Boost 2 shoe. That was the shoe that Kimetto was wearing when he set the world record in the marathon. And the Nike Streak 6, which was basically Nike's fastest marathon shoe at that time. And then when we then started testing people, we started to see very clear trends. And then eventually it turned out that all 18 runners reduced their energy uptake when running in the prototype shoe. And on average, over all the 3 different velocities, that was by 4%.
That's incredible that all 18 runners really improved, because in many cases when we see numbers from studies, it's an average and you have responders and non-responders, but
Exactly.
it's really cool.
Yeah, we
So
had some variability there, right? So some people only improved 2%, some were more in the 6%. So just because that the total effect was 4% allowed us to even the people with small responses to still have a benefit. So that was kind of the key to that, I think.
do you have a hypothesis for why those changes between individuals, that variance is there? Like, are there any particular things that make some people get even bigger benefits than others in those shoes?
Yeah, we thought about that a lot, and it's hard to say. I mean, hypothesizing at first, we were thinking maybe sort of the heavier runners might have more of a benefit from this new foam, and the other thing was related to foot strike pattern. What we did see sort of overall was that it wasn't really strong significant effect, but that the heel strikers seem to have more of a 4.5% benefit versus the forefoot midfoot strikers more like a 3.5. But like, yeah, overall we couldn't really find a lot of uh, other factors that would influence which person would have a big benefit and which person would have a small benefit. It wasn't definitely not mass. Wasn't stride frequency. And also, like I said, the strike pattern was there. It wasn't the big effect. And then since then, we have done some more follow-up testing, and there we didn't really see it. So it might have been just the 9 people that were for foot striking versus the 9 people that were not in our study. Because it's always hard if you have 18 runners and you see changes in energetics to actually find a clear determining factor that explains is who is going to have big savings and who is going to have small savings.
Yeah, and of course, there's always going to be some variability, and it may be just natural variability. So,
Yeah.
I guess we don't know at this point. But 4%, that's a couple of follow-up questions. That's running economy or the energetic cost of running. So, first, what is that compared to? 4% compared to what?
Yes. So we measure oxygen uptake and CO2 production to get us a measure of energy expenditure. And we use 2 baseline shoes. And originally we set out to compare it to the marathon world record shoe from Adidas, so the Adios 2 that Kimera was wearing, and then we also included the Nike Streak shoe. And I think if I remember the numbers correctly, it was about a 4.0% better than the Adidas shoe and a 4.1% better than the Streak shoe. But both the Nike Streak and the Nike Prototype had some added mass in there because we wanted to make sure ahead of time we didn't know how big of a effect to see. So we wanted to see that any effect we saw was actually due to the shoe properties and not just because they were lighter. So so 4% compared to basically the 2 most common fast marathon shoes out there. But obviously that is sort of confounded by the fact that Adidas and Nike are the big companies that sponsor the fastest marathoners. So those are more likely to run the faster time. So there might have been other shoes out there from other brands that we didn't compare, but we can't test all shoes out there, right? So we had to pick, and we picked the shoes that were worn most commonly by the 10 fastest times up till then.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. I would assume that the R&D expenditure of the other shoe companies than Adidas and Nike combined don't even come anywhere close to any one of those alone anyway. So it makes sense to compare to those shoes. And 4% more or less energy expenditure or energetic cost. How much faster can you run with that? And I guess that's going to depend on the speed. Can you elaborate a bit on what that translates to in terms of speeds?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and we're still trying to figure that out completely. So um, what we do know, it's not a one-to-one relationship, and a long time we thought that. So when you think about how we typically measure running performance and energy cost, is like if you go faster, you use more energy. But it doesn't mean that if you go 4% faster, that you use 4% more energy. Those things are slightly uncoupled, or I mean, they're coupled, but they're not linearly related. So more recently, we went back to sort of do an overview of the literature of different studies that all measured how does energy cost increases with velocity. Um, Most of those studies are performed on treadmills. And the good thing is for treadmill studies, you can control the speed very carefully, and you're not depending on whether it's windy outside or not if you have a tailwind, headwind. But at the same time, you don't have wind at all, so there's no air resistance. So what we did recently, we sort of combined all those studies and then added another classical term from a wind tunnel study showing that if energy cost increases with velocity on a treadmill, it's even going to be increasing more outside, because the faster you go outside, the more air resistance there is, and the bigger the effect of air resistance increases your energy cost even more. So bringing all those things together really points out that how much benefit or how much faster you can run with a 4% improvement in running economy really depends on how fast you're running to start off. I think what we landed on is if you're, by combining all the numbers, it's basically around a 3-hour marathon, you get about 4% for 4%. But if we're thinking about Kipchoge and its 2-hour marathon, at that point, because he's running so much faster, and both the fact that he's running so much faster on the treadmill alone makes the energy costs go up more, and then adding the air resistance makes it even worse. So in his case, that would only come down to a 2.6%. At the same time, on the other side of the spectrum, when you're slower, um, your energy cost does not increase that steeply with increases in velocity, and that actually suggests that a specific benefit in running economy would allow you to have an even bigger gain in speed.
And so for example, the 4-hour marathoner, do you have any numbers off the top of your head, roughly what that would
Well, we
translate?
with the paper we recently published, we actually released an Excel sheet to get at those questions. So I have it open for me, and I can quickly put in a 4-hour marathoner.
Yeah, you can do that, and while you do it, I can say to the listeners that we'll make sure that we have it in the show notes for this episode. So that will be scientifictriathlon.com/TTS179, I believe. So we'll link to that so that anybody can. And I remember now that I have used that spreadsheet. It was
yeah.
very handy.
So I ran the numbers now for a 4-hour marathoner. You'll get let's assume a 4% increase in running economy. That allows you to actually run 4.2% faster. So that's basically taking off 10 minutes of your marathon time. Versus if you would be the 2-hour marathoner, for everything else the same, you will only get a 2.5% benefit, and that will only take off 3 minutes of a 2-hour marathon. So that definitely shows the effect of running velocity on your savings and improvements in time.
Yeah. It's still like for the age groupers listening, that 3-hour marathon is like, even for most fast age groupers, 3 hours for the marathon is still pretty fast.
Yes.
There are not that many that can run a 3-hour marathon. So for most, we will have sort of that 1-to-1 scenario, I guess, and then we will have also the the ones that are slower than 3 hours, so they will get even more. So it definitely points to the fact that this is actually something that is really beneficial. We're not really talking about marginal gains anymore. This is bigger than marginal gains.
Yeah, so there's one thing I want to add to that is here I assume this 4% carries on to those speeds. So we did not test the shoe anywhere slower than 3 hours. So um, I cannot make the claim that for a 4 hour marathoner they will get a 4% benefit in running economy on average on their speed. But we do know that if you would go to a lab and you would know that this intervention saves you X percent, then that means in your case, as a 4 hour marathoner, you're going to be slightly faster than that X percent.
Yeah, that is a great point. That is a great point. All right, so let's go back to shoes in general. There's one more question, a follow-up that I had on something you mentioned early on, and it was about how you mentioned that cushioning in general is good for economy, but weight is bad in terms of the shoe. So those seem to be a bit at odds with each other, of course, because cushioning is going to have some weight.
Exactly.
Can you talk a little bit more about those, how that trade-off is made, and also are there any other variables in footwear that we know to be good just in general to, I guess, help the listeners make shoe purchasing decisions?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So we always have been aware of this trade-off. Obviously, that if you add more cushioning, the shoe is going to be heavier, and we knew that trade-off existed, and that at some point people were comparing barefoot running to running with shoes, and then some of them saw benefits, some of them didn't see differences. But then, like around 2012 or so, people from our lab here in Colorado sort of all grouped all those studies together and looked at it more closely and started to see that the studies that did see benefits for barefoot running were the studies that, as their baseline shoe condition, use fairly heavy shoes like 350 grams or more. So yeah, if your baseline shoe weighs 350 grams, if you take it off, there might be a benefit. But if you're looking at other studies that used 150-gram shoe, if you take that off, it's not necessarily better, and it might even be worse. So that was a nice indication, and they then followed up with another study where they basically took the cushioning out of the shoe and put it on the surface. So they had this big treadmill with big rollers, and then they reached out to Nike, and Nike provided them with some foam. So rather than having the cushion EVA foam in the shoe, they got these big slats that they then used and put around the treadmill belt. So in that case, we could test energy cost of running, and all the runners were running barefoot on a very rigid treadmill. And then, in addition, they run barefoot on a very rigid treadmill with 1 centimeter of EVA foam on top of it, and that would just follow the belt. And when they did that study, they clearly quantified that just the benefit of having a soft landing can save you more than 1%. It's like 1.5% of energy. So you take the mass of the shoe out of the equation because the cushioning is now on the surface and not on the foot anymore. And when you do that, you see that the benefit of cushioning is actually 1 to 1.5%. And that was just with the custom, traditional EVA foam of the time. And like I also mentioned earlier, is that since then, I mean, Nike has developed an airbag, which is better than EVA. Adidas has built their Boost foam, which is 1% better than EVA. Now, the new Nike foam in the Vaporfly shoes is even better than that. Obviously, the other brands have their own foams, Flight Foam, all different blends of EVA and all optimized for energy return and softness. So all of them will probably be slightly even better than the ones they used in the study at the time. So there's clearly a benefit of cushioning, and it was interesting because that study was probably an important part of the reasoning of how Nike came about to eventually build this Vaporfly shoe. Is that at that point they decided, so let's forget about mass for a while and just try to build a shoe that optimizes everything else, and then we can deal with the mass later. And they set out to do it, and then eventually turned out really lucky because then the new foam they implemented turned out to be also really light. So then it was really easy to get of the mass effect, but it wasn't their initial goal. They really stepped back from this arms race on getting the lighter and lighter shoe, and actually valued the cushioning and tried to optimize cushioning and energy return properties, and then later deal with the mass issues.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense when you explain what they did in that study with the foam on the treadmill and thinking of running on the track and how that feels and I guess is fast, and why tracks aren't made of asphalt or anything
Yeah.
like that. One thing you mentioned EVA as a base material for foams. I guess what is EVA? What does it stand for?
It's acetyl vinyl. Wait, it is ethyl vinyl acetate. I think I don't
Okay.
know how to pronounce it in English correctly either, but it's basically the most common foam that you will see in any running shoe around, except for the Adidas Boost, which is it's a different material. But I think most training shoes out there and most raining shoes, race shoes from different brands all will have some sort of EVA in there because it's really durable and it's soft, it's cushioned, but the energy return properties are not ideal. And different brands use different procedures of, of mixing that foam with other foams and more rubbery substances to both have the benefit of durability, cushioning, and to optimize energy return. Um, but then, like I said, the Boost foam is started off from a different material, and the new Nike Pebax foam is also not an EVA foam. But
Okay.
most training shoes are, just because you can get more miles out of them out of EVA.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because that reminded me that there's talk about the 4% shoes not lasting very long, at least not with that good recoil and good economy. So, how do you have what's your recommendation? I guess how long would you run in those
Yeah.
shoes and expect them to still work for you very well?
Yeah, it's a good question. We didn't really quantify that. For our study, we made sure that none of the shoes actually went over 30 miles. And at that point, we sent the shoes back to do the material testing, and we saw that the, after 30 miles, they were still as good as new. Um, but then I am aware, and I've experienced myself as well, that as soon as you go closer to 200 miles, things start to function less well. But like I said, I haven't seen actual data on it, so I wouldn't really take my word for granted there. I think, yeah, I also haven't really put my shoes to a lot of miles yet, just because I only use them for races because I know that might not last very long. But if you were really interested in and do a lot of races, or you do use them for workouts as well, it's something to keep an eye out. But it's hard for me to put a number on it because I haven't seen any of the data on it, rather the anecdotes.
Yeah, I'm the same. I got mine 2 weeks ago, and I did a half Ironman distance race this Sunday, and that was the first time that I used the shoes, except for a really short test jog in them.
Yeah,
So, and I'm going to only use them for races. I don't need to be that fast in workouts. It doesn't really matter. So as long as they last in the races
exactly.
and bring the bonuses in terms of economy there. In terms of you've investigated some things that are not footwear, as you mentioned as well. What other biomechanical factors are important for running economy? Can you talk a little bit about that more generally?
Yeah, it's a hard question because there's a lot of different studies on small sample sizes that might seem to be indicating that one thing might be important over the other. I think from a biomechanics perspective, thinking about people's running form, I believe that most people sort of self-optimize, and through years of training, they find out and like unconsciously find out their best way to run. Um, um, but then if you think about biomechanics in a more broader scale, we did some other interesting thought experiments related to this 2-hour marathon concept, so thinking about how we improve running performance by tapping into these biomechanical things we know about running. And one of the things that came out there was really running behind other runners. So obviously the triathlon community is fairly well aware with the benefits of drafting in cycling. But it also seems to hold, at least for people at Kipchoge's 2-hour marathon pace, that running behind another runner saves you energy. It's interesting because the data that is out there is really old. It's from a 1970 wind tunnel test where they had one runner run behind one other runner. But they did see at that time that the metabolic savings were around 6%, and they from running behind another runner, and that was kind of independent of running velocity.
6% of energy cost, you mean?
Yeah, so that does indicate that whether you're running at a 2-hour pace or at a 4-hour pace, that in both cases you'll get about a 6% benefit in energy costs from running. That was really close. That was 1 meter behind another runner. So obviously, that's probably too close to actually do, unless you're running with your twin sister who has exactly the same gait as you have. But just running with more people of different heights and different step lengths and cadences, it's tricky to run that close behind another runner. But there's definitely benefits, specifically if you have a race where there is a substantial tailwind on one section. If you could rotate like you always would do on a bike, you can also apply that for running and get some benefits there. We also quantified the benefits of downhill running. It's obviously that if you just have start at the top of a high mountain and run all the way down, you can probably run faster, even though when you start talking about the marathon distances, like your muscle damage builds up over time. So maybe that interferes with that. But what we did for that study was then just look at the IAAF regulations for what is record eligible, and they said that you can drop a maximum of 42 meters over the 42 kilometers marathon race. And then we quantified, well, let's assume that we do exactly that. How much faster could one run? And that saves you about half a minute at Kipchoge pace again. So
what do you compare that to? A completely flat course?
Yeah, exactly. So if you have a completely flat course versus you would drop those allowed 42 meters, you can go slightly faster. Obviously, there's not a perfectly flat course, and most of them have some slight hills or bridges or other things where there is some change in elevation. And every time you run up a bridge and down a bridge, that's going to be worse versus just running everything on a level.
Yeah, I remember running Berlin one year. I ran marathons before getting into triathlon, and that's as flat as you could possibly imagine. But it did have a couple of those small bridges, so it wasn't completely flat. So, but yeah, that's really interesting, and I think that drafting like that's a surprisingly big effect in terms of energetic saving. And one thing that I remember from reading and studying and having interviews in aerodynamics in cycling is that in cycling, at least, there is this we know that you basically you save more at higher speeds because of the wind resistance, but on the other hand, you're going to be out on the course for a shorter time, so it all sort of evens out in the end. Whether you're a slower cyclist that get some certain aerodynamic advantage compared to a faster cyclist, because you're going to save slightly less per time unit, but you're going to be out there for a longer time. So maybe something similar does apply in running as well.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Is there anything interesting that you've done in your work that we haven't talked about that would be cool for the listeners to know that you want to mention?
Well, we have been doing some cycling shoe research as well recently, and we're still working on that. But it was kind of interesting for me to see that when you just ride at a steady speed, at a steady speed and at around up to 150 watts, it's not necessarily a difference in your efficiency whether you're wearing carbon fiber shoes with the cleats versus just like the old pedals and your Nike free shoe on top of it. So that was kind of cool study. But then we recently obviously showed that as soon as it comes down to high power outputs, there's definitely the benefit of the cleats and the cycling shoes.
That's actually a really interesting knowledge, because most people, beginners doing their first triathlons, are going to be below that 150 watts anyway in their races mostly. So
yeah, so I think
the common piece of advice is to just do it on any bike that you can find. You don't need to buy a bike for doing your first triathlon. So this shows that you're not really losing anything by doing that.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see if you were just wearing your Vaporfly 4% running shoes on your bike all the time, then you might get some additional savings from not changing shoes in the transitions too. So, but then, like I said, that's for steady state cycling, and I think most triathlon courses will force you to slow down in the turns, then speed up, and there might be some hills and things like that, where every time there's a change in intensity, then there might be a benefit of having a more secure connection to the pedal. But under 150 watts, that's probably not going to be too much of an effect of shoe and footwear there.
Yeah, well, I think that they're doing, since they're having the mixed relay is getting into the Olympics now for Tokyo in 2020. I think the New Zealand team, they used some sort of, not the normal system for clipping in, some sort of platform shoes that were, I don't really know how it works, to be honest, but some way of getting, I guess, a trade-off and the best of both worlds there. I'm not entirely sure what it actually is. I just heard about it very loosely. But I think that for those short distances, even though these are the best in the world that we're talking about, they were experimenting with it and potentially seeing that transition costs in such a short and fast race, with each leg of the mixed relay lasting maybe 20 minutes in total for a swim, bike, run. And then you basically hand off the baton to the next person. So there it might make sense to say those extra 10 seconds in transition.
Yeah, no, I agree. And there is, like, as long as your hind leg is on the pedal, I mean, just having your leg there, it would definitely still be in contact with the pedal. And there's studies even at higher power outputs that instruct people to ride like minimizing the dead spot velocity changes and things like that. And there's not a lot of gains there in efficiency by doing that. So as long as your power output is not too high, you're not pulling up on your back pedal so much that your foot is actually coming off the pedal. So it's an interesting that interface there. But like I said, as soon as you go to high power outputs, that becomes important. So I don't suggest to if you're a high power output rider to just put on your running shoes and forget about all the cycling shoes and stuff. But it's something to think about on the lower end of the power output spectrum, and maybe even just experiment with yourself if you really are failing to put out the typical power outputs you have when you change your shoes to running shoes, because they might change your time at the transition.
Yeah, I think the most useful application might be those really short races like mixed relay or different sorts of club races, where you might have very super short courses, not the standard distances, or and the beginners, of course, at the lower power output. And in terms of that pulling up, and I don't think that it's more that's one of the most common myths in cycling, actually, because I think that it's more about not resisting the upstroke on the back end, so you're not actually pulling. So, and you can do that just as well with any shoe. So, but let's start to wrap it up here and move on to the rapid fire questions that I ask all the guests on the podcast. And the first one is, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to endurance sports?
Yeah, I think I'm just gonna go with the Let's Run website, mainly because it's sometimes funny to see how people do not necessarily believe your scientific studies or have opinions about science. That keeps me sharp, and that was one of the reasons why we followed up showing in a scientific paper like, hey, if you see 4% savings, it doesn't mean 4% faster, because those kind of misconceptions on those popular websites like Let's Run are sort of kind of funny for me sometimes, and so sometimes I also get really annoyed by it. But overall, I think I still really like the website and the resources and the ideas about there from people that are just doing the actual thing rather than just the scientists who think about it. It's good to get the feeling of the active people themselves as well.
And there are some real gems there. Like I remember reading long discussions on Renato Canova's marathon training philosophy and those sorts of things. So you can find really, really useful stuff there. What's your favorite piece of gear or equipment?
I think I'm gonna go with my Nike Pegasus Turbo trainer shoes, because they're just a little bit more affordable than the 4% shoes, but they have the same foam. And I use them a lot for my runs, just to not use my expensive shoes that I just keep for racing. I like the Nike Turbo shoes a lot.
And what's a personal habit that has helped you achieve success?
I think, dedication is probably something you will hear a lot, but it's just I'm dedicated. I'm get my running first thing in the morning, and it helps me think things through, and dedicated to the work I do and the science I do. Yep.
Yeah, we do hear it a lot, but just means that it's worth paying attention to.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Wouter. It was really good to talk to you and get your expert knowledge on these topics on footwear and running biomechanics and all things related. So really appreciate your time.
Yeah, sure. I always enjoy talking about the work we do, and get people's idea about it, and see what we can learn from that and take it the next step. So yeah, it was great talking to you.
And are you on Twitter, social media, any where people can follow you?
I am on Twitter as Wouter Sinas, and then the Sinas is actually sort of the Dutch version of the orange soda that we have here. So it's WOUTERSINAS.
And we'll have that in the show notes, so you don't have to stop driving your car and start scrabbling. So it will be easy to find later. Okay, thanks again, Wouter.
All right, thank you.
All right, I hope that you enjoyed that interview. I can say that after I read the papers that Wouter and his group published, and also after using that Excel spreadsheet that we mentioned that we'll link to in the show notes, which helped me to actually see what the speed improvements I could potentially expect from the Nike Vaporflies in for example, a half marathon at the end of a 20.3 race. I just immediately went down to the local Nike shop here in Lisbon and bought those 4% shoes. No question about it. It's more than marginal gains. So they are expensive and we don't really know how long they last. So for me personally, as we discussed, I will only use them for races. And for now, I've only used them in one race. And it's impossible to say how much of a difference they made, if any. But at least I felt very, very good and had a fantastic run. So I will keep using them as my go-to racing shoe. And that way I can get quite a few races out on them before potentially the degradation of material means that they lose their properties that make them so economical. So that's my personal take on this, at least. So maybe that will give you some insight into whether it's worth for you to invest in them or not. Hopefully at some point, though, the industry catches up so that the price point on these kinds of shoes can come down quite a bit. That would definitely be good. As usual, you can find the show notes for today's episode on thattriathlonshow.com. I'll link to the studies that we mentioned and to that Excel spreadsheet where you can calculate your potential run speed and run time improvements based on your level, because as we discussed, slower runners may actually see larger improvements than faster runners. Also, we have plenty of related episodes on running and running economy. And I won't list them all right now, but if you go to scientifictriathlon.com, in the menu bar, you go to more and then to popular topics and running. So more popular topics running. And that page will list all episodes categorized as running episodes, and you can go and have a look there because there are plenty of episodes about, for example, running economy and similar episodes that would be interesting as follow-up episodes for you to listen to. So check them out there. On Thursday, of course, there's a Q&A coming out as per usual. And then next Monday, I interview repeat guest Sebastian Weber, who is back, and this time to talk about movement quality on the bike. And as part of that broader topic, we will also discuss a device that has become quite well known, I would say, in the last couple of years, which is the Leomo Type R, which is a set of motion sensors that can really measure the fine details of your positioning on the bike and the movements that you are making on the bike in various different ways. So Sebastian goes into detail on how he uses the Leomo in his coaching and how the information that you can get from a device like the Leomo can help you improve movement quality and how that translates to improved bike performance. Because as we will get into the movement quality, there is perhaps a bit of something that's become forgotten in the age of a lot of indoor cycling and power focus. And of course, if you heard Sebastian's previous interview, episode 169, you know that he is a no fluff guy, super knowledgeable, incredibly knowledgeable, really. And that episode is no worse than episode 169. It's filled with knowledge and information that you can use and apply. So really recommend that you check in and subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss it, of course. In the meantime, just a reminder, especially for those of you who may be new podcast listeners but are not too familiar with the entire Scientific Triathlon brand, do go to the website, scientifictriathlon.com, and check out our products and services. People are really finding great success with things like the training plans, of course, the coaching and customized training plans, etc. We have something to cater for many different needs. And an email that I just got in that I want to read every now and then, take an opportunity to read a testimonial. This one is from Bento Lira in Brazil. He's 63 years old, and he writes that I have raced a sprint event today after completing your intermediate sprint 12-week plan, and I won my age group. So thank you very much for your well thought out plan. I had a compliance of 96% and felt very, very good throughout the plan and did not get injured or sick. So thank you so much, Bento, for your feedback. I really appreciate it. And if you're looking for a training plan, again, go and check out scientifictriathlon.com. There's a tab called training plans in the menu bar, so you can find all of the different training plans available there. Big thanks to our sponsors, Roka, that you can find on roka.com. Use the promo code TTS, all caps, to get 20% off your entire order. And thank you to Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Take your free online sweat test and use the promo code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps, to get your first box for free. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.